Jessica Miller thought she hit the jackpot when she decided to divorce her millionaire husband who owned a chain of hotels, but a wild trip to Vegas turned her dreams of riches into a nightmare on the streets. Picture this: a woman who spent a decade plotting, scheming, and smiling through gritted teeth, all for a massive payout she believed was guaranteed. Then, in a twist no one saw coming, she ends up with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bitter taste of regret. This is her story, and it's one you won't forget anytime soon. Let me introduce you to Jessica. She's 35 years old now, but back in 2015 she was a 25-year-old bartender with big dreams and an eye for opportunity. That's when she met Henry Baxter, a man who would change her life, though not in the way she expected. Henry, born in 1972, is 53 in 2025, the year our tale unfolds. He's the mastermind behind Baxter Hotels, a chain of luxurious properties stretching along the east coast of the United States, from the bustling boardwalks of Atlantic City to the sun-soaked beaches of Miami. Henry built his empire from scratch, turning empty lots into five-star destinations with his sharp business mind and relentless drive. By the time Jessica crossed his path, he was at the peak of his career, a wealthy man living a life of tailored suits, fine wine, and penthouse views. Jessica, on the other hand, wasn't born into wealth. She grew up in a small town, pouring drinks at local dives to make ends meet, but she always wanted more. She wanted the kind of life she saw in magazines, the kind where money flowed like water and every day felt like a vacation. So when she landed a job at the bar inside Baxter Hotel Atlantic City, she saw her chance. Henry walked in one night, fresh from a meeting, and ordered a whiskey neat. Jessica turned on the charm, flashing a smile that could light up the dimly lit room. He was 43 then, handsome in a rugged way, with a confidence that came from years of success. She was young, ambitious, and quick to spot a golden ticket. 6 months later, they were married in a lavish ceremony at one of his own hotels, surrounded by champagne fountains and guests who whispered about the age gap. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale. Jessica moved into Henry's penthouse at Baxter Hotel Jersey Shore, a sprawling space with ocean views and marble floors. She traded her bartender apron for designer dresses, her tips for a limitless credit card. Photographers snapped her picture at hotel galas, and friends back home envied her new life. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. Jessica didn't love Henry. She didn't even like him much. To her, he was a means to an end, a stepping stone to the fortune she craved. Every time he talked about occupancy rates or renovation budgets, she tuned out, dreaming of the day she'd cash in. She saw their marriage as a business deal, one with a payout she'd collect when the time was right. Henry, for his part, seemed oblivious, or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he saw more than Jessica realized. He was a man who'd built a hotel empire by reading people, negotiating deals, and staying one step ahead. At 43, when they met, he was still in his prime, full of energy and ideas. By 2025, at 53, he'd started to slow down a bit, the stress of running a multi-million-dollar business taking its toll. But his mind was as sharp as ever, a detail that would prove crucial later. Jessica didn't notice that part. She was too busy counting his money in her head, imagining a future where she'd be free of him and flush with cash. Here's where the story gets wild. Jessica had a plan, a carefully crafted scheme, to divorce Henry after 10 years and walk away with $20 million. She'd read the prenup, or so she thought, and believed it secured her half his fortune if she stuck it out long enough, so she waited, playing the dutiful wife while secretly plotting her exit. Then, in 2025, with Henry showing signs of wear and tear, she made her move. She filed for divorce, packed a bag, and jetted off to Vegas to celebrate what she thought was her victory. She pictured herself sipping cocktails by the pool, surrounded by luxury she'd earned through a decade of patience. But life doesn't always follow the script you write. In Vegas, Jessica let loose, spending money like it was already hers, living it up with a new guy she met at the tables. She was on top of the world, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that Henry had one last surprise up his sleeve, and a twist that would flip her world upside down. By the time she got back to Atlantic City, expecting to claim her prize, she found herself locked out of the penthouse, cut off from the bank accounts, and staring at a future she never imagined. From a life of glamour to begging on the streets, Jessica's journey is a roller coaster of greed, betrayal, and a karmic payback that hits like a ton of bricks. If that sounds like a story you want to hear, you're in the right place. This tale has it all: a cunning wife, a savvy husband, a Vegas blowout, and a downfall that'll leave you shaking your head. It's a lesson in how far ambition can take you and how fast it can drop you when you bet on the wrong hand. So grab a seat, hit that like button, and subscribe if you haven't already. We're about to dive into a drama-filled ride you won't be able to look away from. Let's get started. Jessica Miller's story begins in 2015, a year that would define the next decade of her life. She was 25 years old, working as a bartender at Baxter Hotel Atlantic City, one of the crown jewels in Henry Baxter's hotel empire. The place was a marvel, with its glittering chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a view of the ocean that drew tourists from all over. Jessica poured drinks behind the bar, mixing martinis and flashing smiles for tips. She was good at her job, but she hated it. Every night she watched wealthy guests stroll in, their wallets fat with cash, their lives dripping with ease. She wanted that for herself, and she wasn't shy about admitting it. Then Henry walked in and everything changed. Henry Baxter was 43 that year, a man who'd spent 2 decades building Baxter Hotels into a name synonymous with luxury along the East Coast. From Atlantic City to Jersey Shore to Miami, his properties were playgrounds for the rich, places where people came to escape and indulge. He'd started with nothing, a kid from a working-class family who'd scraped his way up through sheer grit. By 2015, he was worth millions, a success story in a tailored suit. That night at the bar, he'd just finished a meeting with investors, his mind buzzing with plans for a new hotel expansion. He ordered a whiskey neat, and Jessica caught his eye. She leaned across the counter, her dark hair falling just so, and made small talk about the weather. Henry laughed, a rare sound from a man usually buried in work. She saw the spark, and she fanned it. 6 months later, they were married. The wedding took place at Baxter Hotel Jersey Shore, a grand affair with 200 guests, a string quartet, and a cake that cost more than Jessica's annual salary as a bartender. Henry spared no expense, turning the day into a showcase of his wealth. Jessica wore a white gown that shimmered under the lights, her smile wide as photographers snapped away. Friends from her old life texted congratulations, tinged with jealousy. To them she'd hit the jackpot, a small-town girl now living in a world of private chefs and chauffeurs. Henry gave her a penthouse on the top floor of the Jersey Shore Hotel, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows, a hot tub on the balcony, and a closet bigger than her childhood bedroom. She had access to his credit cards, a wardrobe of designer labels, and a social calendar packed with events. It was everything she'd dreamed of on the surface. But Jessica wasn't in love. She didn't even pretend to be, at least not to herself. Henry was handsome enough for his age, with a strong jaw and a head of thick hair just starting to grey at the temples. He had a charm that came from confidence, a way of commanding a room without raising his voice. To most women, he might have been a catch. To Jessica, he was a paycheck. She couldn't stand the way he smelled, a mix of espresso from his endless coffee habit and the cologne he wore to meetings. His voice grated on her when he talked business, which was all the time. He'd sit at the dining table in their penthouse, phone pressed to his ear, discussing occupancy rates or plumbing issues while she stared out at the ocean, plotting her next move. She didn't care about his dreams for Baxter Hotels. She cared about what they could buy her. The plan was simple, or so she thought. Jessica had overheard Henry's lawyers mention a prenuptial agreement before the wedding, a document she signed without much thought. Later she got her hands on a copy and studied it late at night while Henry slept. She wasn't a legal expert, but she fixated on one clause. If the marriage lasted 10 years, she'd be entitled to half his personal fortune in a divorce, separate from the hotel company itself. She did the math. Henry was worth at least $40 million in cash and investments, not counting the hotels. That meant $20 million for her if she could stick it out until 2025. 10 years felt like forever, but she was patient. She'd play the role of the perfect wife, smile at his jokes, nod at his stories, and wait for the clock to run out. Then she'd file for divorce and walk away rich. For a decade, Jessica lived that lie. She stood by Henry's side at ribbon cuttings for new Baxter Hotels, her arm linked with his as cameras flashed. She hosted cocktail parties in the penthouse, laughing at the right moments and refilling drinks for his business partners. She learned to mimic the habits of the wealthy, dropping names of designers and vacation spots she'd never cared about before. Henry showered her with gifts, a diamond necklace for their 5th anniversary, a sports car for her 30th birthday. She accepted them with practiced gratitude, tucking them away as part of her future nest egg. Meanwhile, she kept a mental tally of the years, marking them off like a prisoner counting days to freedom. By 2020, she was halfway there. By 2023, she could taste it. Henry didn't seem to notice her detachment. He was too busy running his empire. The hotel business was cutthroat, with competitors popping up and guests demanding more every year. He spent long hours on conference calls, flew to Miami or Atlantic City at a moment's notice, and came home exhausted. Jessica saw the strain in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped a little more each year. By 2025, at 53, he wasn't the same man she'd met. His hair was greyer, his steps slower. He'd started having chest pains, though he brushed them off as stress. She didn't care about his health, not really. She cared that he was still alive, still tying her to this life she'd grown to resent. Every time he coughed or winced, she wondered if he'd drop dead and save her the trouble of a divorce. But she wasn't that lucky, or so she thought. Jessica's patience paid off in her mind when 2025 rolled around. 10 years exactly. She'd done her time, played her part. Henry was showing signs of wear, his doctor visits more frequent, his energy fading. She saw her opening. The prenup clock had ticked down, and she was ready to cash out. She hired a lawyer in secret, a slick guy from New York who promised her a smooth split. She filed the papers, her heart racing with anticipation. $20 million. That's what she saw in her future. A life of private jets, beach houses, and no more pretending to care about hotel profit margins. She packed a suitcase, kissed Henry goodbye one last time, and told him she was visiting a friend. Then she boarded a plane to Vegas, ready to celebrate the end of her sentence and the start of her reward. That's where we leave Jessica for now, high on her own confidence, sipping champagne at 30,000 feet. She thought she'd played the game perfectly, that Henry was just a pawn in her grand scheme. She had no idea what was coming. The penthouse life she'd known for 10 years was about to vanish, and the Vegas trip she saw as a victory lap would mark the beginning of her downfall. Henry Baxter wasn't the fool she took him for. He'd built an empire by being smarter than everyone else in the room, and Jessica was about to learn that the hard way. By the time 2025 arrived, Jessica Miller had reached the finish line of her 10-year plan. She was 35 years old, and Henry Baxter, her husband of a decade, was 53. The past few months had been tense in their penthouse at Baxter Hotel, Jersey Shore. Henry's health was slipping, not dramatically, but enough to notice. He'd started complaining about tightness in his chest, blaming it on the stress of managing his chain of hotels along the East Coast. Jessica didn't care about the details. She saw his fatigue as a sign, a green light for her exit strategy. After a decade of playing the loyal wife, she'd filed for divorce, convinced that $20 million was waiting for her on the other side. The prenup, she believed, was her golden ticket, and she wasn't wasting another day. With the papers submitted, she packed a suitcase and told Henry she was off to visit a friend. Instead, she boarded a flight to Las Vegas, ready to kick off her new life in style. Vegas was Jessica's idea of paradise. She'd been there a few times with Henry for hotel openings or business trips, always tagging along to sip cocktails while he networked, but this time was different. This time it was her show. She checked into a 5-star hotel on the Strip, a sleek tower of glass and lights that wasn't part of the Baxter Hotels chain. She picked it deliberately, a quiet jab at Henry, a way to revel in her independence. The suite she booked was pure luxury, with a king-sized bed draped in silk, a private bar stocked with top-shelf liquor, and a balcony overlooking the neon glow of the city. She tossed her suitcase onto the floor, slipped into a sequined dress that hugged her curves, and headed downstairs to celebrate. $20 million was coming her way, and she was going to spend like it was already in her bank account. The casino was where she met Tony. It was her first night in Vegas, and she wandered into the gaming floor, drawn by the clatter of chips and the hum of excitement. Tony was at the poker table, a lean guy in his early 30s, with dark hair and a smile that promised trouble. He wore a cheap suit but carried himself like he owned the place. Jessica sat down across from him, her confidence sky-high after a few drinks at the bar. She wasn't a pro at poker, but she'd picked up enough from watching Henry's business buddies over the years. She won her first hand, then her second, and Tony raised an eyebrow. "You're good," he said, dealing her another card. She laughed and leaned closer. I'm about to be a lot better, $20 million better. He didn't blink, just grinned and kept the game going. That's how it started. Jessica and Tony hit it off fast. He was a professional gambler, or so he claimed, bouncing between Vegas casinos to make a living. She liked his swagger, the way he didn't ask too many questions about her boastful hints. She told him she was divorcing a rich hotel owner, that she'd be swimming in cash soon. "This is just the warm-up," she said, tossing a stack of chips onto the table. Tony nodded, egging her on. They played late into the night, moving from poker to blackjack, then to roulette. Jessica was on a high winning sum, losing more, but she didn't care. She pulled money from the joint account she shared with Henry, the one she'd been draining for years. Thousands of dollars vanished in hours, spent on bets and bottles of champagne. She figured it didn't matter. 20 million was around the corner. The next day, she woke up late, her head pounding from the night before. Tony was sprawled on the couch in her suite, a half-empty glass in his hand. She smiled, liking the chaos of it all. This was freedom, she thought. No more Henry, no more pretending. She ordered room service, a spread of lobster and caviar that cost more than most people's rent. Tony ate with her, laughing as she recounted stories of Henry's boring hotel meetings. "He's probably still on the phone with some plumber right now," she said, popping a shrimp into her mouth. "Good riddance." Tony suggested they hit the casino again, and she agreed. Why not? She was celebrating a victory she hadn't even claimed yet. That night, Jessica went bigger. She wore a shimmering gold dress, her hair swept up in a style she'd seen on a magazine cover. She and Tony took over the high-stakes tables, drawing a crowd of onlookers. She bet thousands on single hands, her laughter echoing over the clinking chips. She lost more than she won, but it felt like winning. She tipped the dealers with $100 bills, bought rounds of drinks for strangers, and danced to the live band in the lounge. Tony stuck by her side, whispering bets in her ear, his hand on her back. She loved the attention, the way people watched her like she was a star. She imagined this was how her life would be from now on, a whirlwind of glamour and excess. She told Tony over a glass of bourbon, $20 million, that's what's coming. I'll own half his world soon. He smirked and raised his glass. "To your empire," he said. Jessica didn't check her bank account. She didn't need to, or so she thought. She'd been dipping into Henry's money for years, and the joint account always seemed bottomless. She spent like a queen, racking up a bill that would have made Henry's jaw drop. She rented a private VIP room at the casino, complete with a DJ and a light show, just because she could. She and Tony partied there until dawn, surrounded by a rotating cast of hangers-on who cheered her every move. She threw money at slot machines, lost a small fortune on a single spin of the roulette wheel, and laughed it off. "It's nothing," she told Tony, waving a hand. "I've got millions on the way." She pictured Henry back home, oblivious to her spree, signing the divorce papers that would set her free. But here's the thing. Jessica wasn't as smart as she thought. She'd never been good with numbers, never bothered to track the cash flow. The joint account wasn't infinite, and Henry wasn't as clueless as she assumed. While she was in Vegas, living like a movie star, he'd been dealing with his own reality. His health had been faltering, yes, but his mind was still sharp. He'd noticed her withdrawals over the years, the way she spent without a second thought. He'd hired people to watch his finances, and they'd flagged her recent activity. Jessica didn't know it yet, but the account she was draining was about to dry up. She was betting on a future she hadn't secured, and the house always wins in the end. She stayed in Vegas for 3 days, a blur of gambling and glitz. She and Tony became a fixture at the tables, a pair of reckless spenders who lit up the room. She wore that sequined dress like armor, strutting through the casino as if she owned it. She tipped waitresses with wads of cash, ordered bottle service that cost thousands, and lost more money than she could count. She didn't care about the losses. She was riding a wave of triumph. Convinced she'd outsmarted Henry and claimed her prize. She told Tony one night as they stumbled back to her suite, "This is just the beginning. I'm going to live like this forever." He laughed, pulling her close. "You're a star," he said. She believed him. Jessica imagined herself as the heroine of her own story, a woman who'd beaten the odds and walked away with the pot. She thought she was unstoppable, that Vegas was her stage and she was the lead. She imagined herself as the star of the songback, but she didn't know that the biggest game of all was waiting for her back home. Henry had one move left, and it would change everything. Jessica's celebration was about to crash, and she was too drunk on her own delusion to see it coming. Jessica Miller's Vegas spree was in full swing when her phone buzzed on the fourth morning. She was sprawled across the king-sized bed in her suite, the remnants of last night's party scattered around her. Empty champagne bottles littered the floor, and Tony was passed out on the couch, snoring softly. She groaned, her head throbbing from 3 days of non-stop gambling and drinking. The call was from an unknown number, but something told her to pick up. She swiped the screen, expecting maybe a hotel staffer chasing her for the bill. Instead, it was James Carter, Henry Baxter's lawyer. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Jessica, I'm sorry to inform you. Henry passed away last night. He had a heart attack." She sat up, blinking through the haze. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she laughed, a sharp, giddy sound that echoed in the room. "Perfect timing," she said. $20 million, and a few hotels are mine now." She hung up, leapt out of bed and shook Tony awake. "Get up! We're going back to Atlantic City. I'm rich." The news didn't sink in the way it should have. Henry was dead at 53, a shock to anyone who knew him. He'd been a powerhouse, a man who ran his hotel empire with an iron grip. But Jessica didn't care about the how or why. She didn't feel sadness, didn't spare a thought for the man she'd lived with for 10 years. All she saw was dollar signs, a payout bigger than she'd dreamed. She figured the divorce filing wouldn't matter now. Henry's death meant she'd inherit everything, or so she thought. She packed her bags in a frenzy, tossing clothes and jewelry into her suitcase. She booked the next flight to Atlantic City, her mind racing with plans. She'd sell off some of the hotels, keep the penthouse, maybe buy a yacht. Tony stumbled along behind her, half awake but grinning at the prospect of her windfall. "You're set for life," he said, and she nodded. "You have no idea." The flight back was a blur. Jessica sipped a mimosa in first class, staring out the window with a smug smile. She pictured herself walking into Baxter Hotel Atlantic City, the staff bowing as the new owner. She'd spent a decade waiting for this, enduring Henry's endless business calls and stale cologne. Now it was hers, all of it. She landed in the late afternoon, took a cab straight to the hotel, and strutted through the lobby like she owned the place. In her mind, she already did. She wore that same red dress from Vegas, the one she'd bought with Henry's money, its fabric clinging to her like a victory flag. She didn't bother going home first. She wanted the will read immediately, wanted to hear the words that would make her rich. She called James Carter from the lobby, demanding he meet her now. He agreed, his tone still eerily neutral. The reading took place in a conference room on the top floor of Baxter Hotel Atlantic City. Jessica sat at the head of the table, legs crossed, her nails tapping impatiently. James Carter walked in, a grey-haired man in a pinstripe suit carrying a leather folder. Behind him came Olivia, Henry's daughter from his first marriage. She was 28, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air. Jessica barely acknowledged her. A few hotel managers filed in too, old-timers who'd worked for Henry since the early days. They looked nervous, shifting in their seats. Jessica didn't care. She leaned forward as James opened the folder and began to read. "This is the last will and testament of Henry Baxter, updated 2 weeks ago." Her stomach flipped. 2 weeks ago, that was right before she filed for divorce. She brushed it off. It didn't matter. She was his wife. James's voice was steady as he read. "To my daughter, Olivia Baxter, I leave my personal condominium in Philadelphia and a sum of $100,000 to ensure her stability." Olivia nodded, her face blank. Jessica smirked. "A condo and pocket change?" She waited for her part, her pulse quickening. James continued. "The remainder of my estate, including all cash assets, investments, and full ownership of Baxter Hotels, totaling approximately $20 million, I bequeath to the Baxter Hospitality Fund." Jessica frowned. "A fund? What was that?" James kept going. "This fund will support retired hotel employees and train young workers entering the hospitality industry along the East Coast. It is my legacy to the people who built my dream with me." He paused, then looked at Jessica. "To my wife, Jessica Miller Baxter, I leave a $100 gift card redeemable at any Baxter Hotels restaurant, with this note. You loved living the high life, so enjoy one last meal. Don't expect anything more from me." The room went silent. Jessica's smirk froze, then melted into confusion. She stared at James, her mouth open. What did you say?" He repeated it, word for word, and handed her the gift card. It was plastic, shiny, with the Baxter Hotels logo embossed in gold. She snatched it, her hands shaking. This is a joke, right? I get 20 million, I'm his wife. We were married 10 years. James shook his head. The prenup you signed only applied to a divorce settlement. Henry's death supersedes it, and he updated his will. You get the gift card. Olivia spoke up, her voice cold. Dad was smarter than you thought. He saw through you years ago. Jessica's head snapped towards her. Shut up! I put up with him for a decade. I deserve this. She stood, slamming the card on the table. I'll fight this. I'll sue. That money's mine. James adjusted his glasses. You can try, but the will is airtight. Henry had it notarized with witnesses, and his mental capacity was sound. He knew exactly what he was doing. Jessica's knees buckled. She sank back into the chair, her mind reeling. $20 million gone, not to his daughter, not to some mistress, but to a fund for hotel workers she'd never met. She thought of the prenup, her ace in the hole, and realized it was useless now. Henry had died before the divorce went through, and he'd outplayed her from beyond the grave. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound. 10 years! I gave him 10 years for $100 and a meal? The fallout was immediate. James explained that Henry's estate had already taken steps. The joint account Jessica had been draining in Vegas was frozen the moment he died, a safeguard built into his financial plan. She'd spent the last of it on her spree, thousands of dollars on poker and champagne, leaving nothing behind. The penthouse at Baxter Hotel, Jersey Shore, wasn't hers either. It belonged to the company, and with Henry's death it passed to the fund. Hotel staff were instructed to pack her things and leave them in the lobby. She had no claim to anything, no home, no cash, no leverage. The managers in the room avoided her eyes, some hiding smirks. They'd never liked her, the bartender who'd married the boss and acted like royalty. Jessica stumbled out of the conference room. Her red dress wrinkled, her makeup smudged from tears she couldn't stop. She took the elevator down, clutching the gift card like it was a lifeline. In the lobby she saw her suitcases stacked by the door, a bellhop standing guard. Guests whispered as she passed, their stares cutting through her. She stepped outside, the salty Atlantic City air hitting her face. She walked to the boardwalk, her heels clicking on the wood, and stopped in front of Baxter Hotel. The neon sign glowed above her, a monument to Henry's legacy. She looked at it, then down at the gift card. I served my whole life for this guy, and now I've got nothing, she muttered. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tony. Where's my cut? You owe me. She checked her wallet. $50 left. That was it. Henry had won. He'd built an empire by staying ahead, and his final move was a masterstroke. Jessica's dream of riches was dust, and the collapse of her world was complete. Jessica Miller's world unraveled faster than she could blink. 1 minute, she was standing in the lobby of Baxter Hotel, Atlantic City, staring at her suitcases piled up like an eviction notice. The next, she was outside, the cold wind off the Atlantic whipping through her red dress. She clutched that $100 gift card, her only inheritance from a decade with Henry Baxter, and the reality hit her hard. She had nowhere to go, no penthouse, no bank account, no plan. The $20 million she'd counted on was gone, funneled into a fund for hotel workers she'd never cared about. Her suitcases sat by the curb, a bellhop watching her with pity in his eyes. She grabbed them, dragging them down the boardwalk, her heels wobbling on the uneven wood. She didn't know where she was headed, but she couldn't stay there, not with the hotel's staff whispering and guests staring. She stopped at a bench overlooking the ocean, dropping her bags with a thud. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Tony, the Vegas gambler she'd parted with. You owe me $500 for the tables. Where's my money? She laughed, a bitter sound swallowed by the waves. She had $50 in her wallet, the last of Henry's cash she'd spent so freely. She typed back, I've got nothing. Leave me alone. He didn't reply, and she knew he wouldn't. Tony was a hustler, not a friend. She'd been a mark to him, just like she'd seen Henry as a mark. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it didn't soften the blow. She sat there, the gift card in her hand, and wondered how it had come to this. 10 years of plotting, and all she had was a meal voucher. Jessica tried to think. She had friends, didn't she? People she'd partied with at Henry's galas, women she'd shopped with using his credit cards. She scrolled through her phone, dialing numbers she hadn't called in months. One by one they went to voicemail or hung up after a quick excuse. Sorry, Jess, I'm busy. Can't help you right now. Call me later, okay. She'd been the rich wife, the one with the penthouse and the designer bags. Without Henry's money, she was nothing to them. She tossed the phone into her bag, her throat tight. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange, and the boardwalk was emptying out. She needed a place to sleep, but $50 wouldn't get her a room, not even in the cheapest motel. That first night she stayed awake on the bench, her suitcases pulled close. The air grew cold, and she shivered in her dress, too proud to dig through her bags for a jacket. She watched the lights of Baxter Hotel flicker in the distance, a reminder of the life she'd lost. She thought about Henry, about his final jab with that gift card. He'd known her better than she realized, seen through her fake smiles and calculated affection. She'd underestimated him, and it cost her everything. Her stomach growled, but she didn't use the card, not yet. It felt like admitting defeat, and she wasn't ready for that. She told herself she'd figure something out, that this was temporary. She'd sue the estate, find a loophole, get back what was hers. But deep down she knew James Carter was right. The will was ironclad. Days turned into weeks. Jessica's $50 ran out fast, spent on cheap coffee and a burger from a boardwalk stand. She sold her sports car, the one Henry gave her for her 30th birthday, but the cash didn't last. She'd never owned it outright, it was in his name, and the dealership took it back when the estate claimed it. Her jewelry went next, pawned for a fraction of its worth. The diamond necklace from their 5th anniversary got her $200, enough for a few nights in a rundown motel off the Strip. But the money dried up and she was back on the streets. She started sleeping under the boardwalk, near the supports where the wind wasn't as bad. She used her suitcases as a pillow, her clothes stuffed inside, growing damp from the salty air. She stopped wearing makeup, stopped caring about her hair. The woman who'd once turned heads in a sequined dress was gone. Jessica became a fixture in Atlantic City, one of those faces people passed without a second glance. She'd sit near Baxter Hotel, her back against a wall, watching tourists check in. Sometimes she'd hold out a hand, asking for spare change. Most ignored her, but a few tossed coins her way. She collected enough to buy food from the dollar menu, stretching every cent. She used the gift card eventually, walking into the hotel restaurant one rainy afternoon. The hostess recognized her, eyes widening, but didn't say a word. Jessica ordered a steak, the cheapest on the menu, and ate slowly, savoring it. It was the last taste of luxury she'd have, and it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a goodbye. She left the restaurant, the gift card spent, and went back to her spot under the boardwalk. Olivia, Henry's daughter, moved on differently. She took her condo in Philadelphia and her $100,000 without a fuss. She'd never been close to her father, not after his first divorce, but she respected him. She didn't gloat over Jessica's fall, didn't need to. She started a small business, a coffee shop, and lived quietly. Jessica saw her once driving by in a modest car and felt a pang of something, not jealousy, but resentment. Olivia had a roof over her head, a life, while Jessica had nothing. But Olivia hadn't schemed for it. She'd just taken what was given and walked away. Jessica couldn't say the same. Months passed, and Jessica's pride faded. She stopped talking about lawsuits or comebacks. She stopped dreaming of the $20 million. She'd sit by the ocean, staring at the waves, and think about the decade she'd wasted. She'd married Henry for money, not love, and it had seemed so smart at the time. Now she was 35, homeless, with no skills beyond pouring drinks and no one to turn to. She'd gambled on greed and lost. Henry's face haunted her, not the tired man of 2025, but the confident 43-year-old she'd met in 2015. He'd built something lasting, a legacy for his workers, while she'd built nothing. She muttered to herself sometimes, "I should have seen it, he was always smarter." Passers-by thought she was crazy, just another lost soul on the boardwalk. Atlantic City didn't care about Jessica's story. The hotels kept running, the tourists kept coming. Baxter Hotels thrived under the fund, hiring new staff, paying pensions to retirees. Henry's name lived on, etched into plaques and memories, while Jessica faded into the background. She'd wake up to the sound of seagulls, her breath visible in the morning chill, and drag herself through another day. She'd beg near the hotel entrance, her voice hoarse. "Spare $1?" Some recognized her, former staff or guests, but they didn't stop. She was a cautionary tale now, a whisper among the bellhops. "That's Henry's wife. Used to live upstairs. Here's the lesson, folks. Greed can drive you to chase the stars, but it won't catch you when you fall." Jessica bet everything on a payout, thinking Henry was just a stepping stone. He proved her wrong, even in death. His empire stood tall while she crumbled. It's a harsh truth, but a real one. Ambition without heart leaves you empty, and Jessica learned that the hard way. So what do you think? Did she deserve this, or was Henry too cruel? Could you risk it all like she did, betting a decade on a dream that might slip away? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you'd do in her shoes.